At 7:42 in the morning on August 17, 1942, a 43-year-old mechanic crouched under the wing of a Douglas A-20 Havoc at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Australia. His hands were covered in grease. His uniform was stained with hydraulic fluid. He was watching mechanics weld 50-caliber machine guns into a bomber's nose where the bombardier used to sit. His name was Paul Gunn. The pilots called him Pappy because of his age. He was old enough to be the father of most men in his squadron. He had spent 21 years in the United States Navy before transferring to the Army Air Forces. He was not a general. He was not even a combat pilot by official designation. He was a maintenance officer, a mechanic, a man who fixed broken airplanes. But here is what the history books almost forgot to mention. This ordinary mechanic was about to do something that Army engineers would declare impossible. He was about to modify bombers in ways that violated every engineering principle they knew. And those modifications would sink over 800 Japanese ships before the war ended. His wife Polly and their 4 children were trapped in a Japanese prison camp in Manila at that very moment. They had been there since January. 7 months. Every single day, Paul Gunn woke up knowing his family was suffering while he could do nothing to save them. That knowledge drove him. It consumed him. It turned him into the most dangerous aircraft designer the Japanese would ever face. But first, he had to prove everyone wrong. The situation in the Southwest Pacific in the summer of 1942 was catastrophic. The Japanese were winning. They were winning badly. The 5th Air Force was losing bombers faster than America could build replacements. In July alone, the 3rd Attack Group had lost 11 A-20 Havoc bombers trying to hit Japanese convoys from high altitude. 11 bombers. 11 crews. Dozens of young men burned alive or drowned in the Coral Sea. The problem was simple and brutal. American bombardiers could not hit moving ships from 10,000 feet when they dropped to lower altitudes for better accuracy. Japanese deck gunners shredded them with anti-aircraft fire. Captain Ed Larner had watched 3 of his crews die the previous week. 3 aircraft exploding into fireballs over the ocean. 3 groups of men who had been eating breakfast with him that morning and were gone by lunch. The Japanese knew American bombers were ineffective. They knew it with absolute certainty. So they reinforced New Guinea whenever they wanted. Convoys of transport ships carried thousands of troops and tons of supplies across the Bismarck Sea without fear. The Japanese commanders were so confident that they barely bothered with fighter escorts. Why would they need protection from bombers that could not hit them? Every failed bombing raid meant more Japanese soldiers landing on New Guinea. Every missed target meant the war dragged on longer. Every lost bomber meant Paul Gunn was one day further from liberating his family. The generals in Washington had no solutions. The engineers at Wright Field in Ohio had no solutions. The aircraft designers at North American Aviation had no solutions. They all agreed on one thing. The laws of physics were clear. Bombers bombed from altitude. That was what they were designed to do. Anything else was suicide. But Paul Gunn did not care about the laws of physics as the experts understood them. He cared about killing Japanese ships. He cared about getting closer to Manila. He cared about seeing his wife and children again. Paul Gunn had been flying since 1923. He had started as a Navy enlisted man, working his way up from deckhand to aviation mechanic to pilot. He understood aircraft not from textbooks, but from thousands of hours with his hands inside engines. He knew what planes could do because he had fixed them when they broke and rebuilt them when they crashed. He had moved to the Philippines in 1939 to start an airline. Philippine Airlines. He flew passengers between islands in small Beechcraft planes. He knew the archipelago from the air better than anyone alive. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Forces commissioned him immediately. They needed his knowledge. They needed his skills. They needed someone who could keep aircraft flying in impossible conditions with no spare parts and no support. What they did not know was that they had just recruited the most innovative aircraft modifier of the entire war. Gunn's idea came from desperation. If bombers could not hit ships from high altitude, they would hit ships from low altitude. Not 5,000 feet. Not 1,000 feet. 50 feet. They would fly so low that missing was impossible. They would skip bombs across the water like children skipping stones on a pond. The bombs would hit the ships at the waterline and explode inside the hulls. But there was an obvious problem. Flying that low meant flying directly into Japanese anti-aircraft fire. The deck guns would tear the bombers apart before they could release their bombs. Every approach would be a suicide run. Unless the bombers could kill the gunners first. Gunn wanted to turn bombers into strafers. He wanted to mount forward-firing machine guns in the nose. Not the standard .30 caliber guns that came with the A-20. Those rounds bounced off ship armor like hail off a metal roof. He wanted .50 caliber guns. The same heavy machine guns that fighters carried. Guns that could punch through steel. The idea was insane by every standard of aircraft design. The A-20 bombardier compartment was never meant to hold 4 heavy machine guns. The weight would shift the center of gravity forward. The plane would become unstable. It might not even fly. Gunn did not have blueprints. He did not have stress calculations. He did not have wind tunnel data. He had wrecked P-39 and P-40 fighters sitting at the edge of the airfield. The pilots who flew those fighters were dead. The guns were not. He pulled the .50 caliber weapons from the wreckage and started welding. General George Kenney had just arrived as the new 5th Air Force commander. He was desperate for anything that might work. When Gunn explained his idea, Kenney gave him 1 week to prove the concept. 7 days to build something that engineers said could not exist. 7 days to save the Pacific Campaign or prove the experts right. Gunn worked 18 hours a day. He mounted 4 .50 caliber guns on a steel frame inside the nose compartment. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. 4 guns, plus 2,000 rounds of ammunition, added nearly 500 pounds to the front of the aircraft. The modification looked crude. The welds were rough. The mounting brackets were improvised from scrap metal. The test flight almost killed the pilot. The A-20 barely climbed off the runway. The nose wanted to drop. The aircraft felt like it was fighting the pilot every second. The test pilot reported that the plane handled like an angry mule. It wanted to flip forward and dive into the ground. Gunn spent 2 days rebalancing the aircraft. He moved equipment to the rear. He adjusted the tail trim. He recalculated weight distribution through trial and error. The second test pilot reported that the plane still flew angry, but at least it flew. On September 12, 1942, 16 modified A-20s attacked the Japanese airfield at Buna. They came in at treetop level, guns hammering. The sound was unlike anything the Japanese had ever heard from a bomber. Instead of bombs falling from the sky, they faced a wall of tracers screaming horizontally across the airfield. The strafers destroyed 14 Japanese aircraft on the ground. They killed every anti-aircraft gunner who tried to fire back. They suppressed the entire defensive network in minutes. 0 A-20s lost. 0. The modification that could not work had just achieved a perfect combat record. General Kenney wanted more immediately. But the A-20 had limitations. Its range was too short to reach Japanese bases across the Owen Stanley Mountains. Its bomb load was too light for shipping strikes. Gunn needed a bigger platform. He needed the B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 was a medium bomber with twin engines, longer range, and heavier payload capacity. More importantly, it had more space in the nose for guns. Much more space. In December 1942, Gunn pulled the bombardier position and nose guns from a B-25C and started welding again. This time he went further. 4 .50 caliber guns in the nose. 4 more in external cheek packs bolted to the fuselage sides. He rotated the top turret forward so it could fire ahead. 10 forward-firing guns on a single aircraft. Then he added 2 more on each side. 14 guns total. 215 pounds of lead per second when all guns fired simultaneously. The ground crew at Townsville called it Pappy's Folly. They were certain the thing would never get off the ground. The nose was so heavy that the tail wheel lifted off the tarmac when the plane was parked. Pilots joked that they should add anchors to the tail just to keep it from tipping forward. Gunn flew the prototype himself. He flew it to Charters Towers to demonstrate it to the 3rd Attack Group. The plane was nose-heavy beyond anything in the engineering manuals. He had to use full back pressure on the control stick just to keep it level during takeoff. His arms were shaking by the time he reached altitude. But once airborne, the B-25 was a flying destroyer. When Gunn opened fire on the practice target, the concentrated firepower shredded everything in front of him. The effect was devastating. A single pass could clear an entire ship deck of defenders. General Kenny ordered 12 more conversions immediately. The 81st Air Depot Group in Townsville worked 18-hour shifts to modify every available B-25. By February 1943, they had 30 strafers ready for combat. 30 aircraft that every engineer said should not exist. 30 flying gun platforms that were about to change the war. Then Kenny sent the blueprints to Wright Field in Ohio. The Army Air Force's engineers studied Gunn's modifications for 3 days. They ran calculations. They consulted aerodynamics experts. They reviewed stress tolerance data. Then they sent a message back to Australia. The modifications were impractical. The aircraft balance was wrong. The planes were too heavy. They would not fly properly. The engineering team recommended grounding every modified B-25 immediately. They recommended stopping all further conversions. They recommended that Colonel Gunn be informed that his designs violated fundamental aircraft engineering principles. Kenny was in Washington when the message arrived. He walked into General Hap Arnold's office, where the Wright Field engineers were waiting to explain why Pappy Gunn's gunship was impossible. Kenny told them that 12 of those impossible airplanes had just played the key role in destroying an entire Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. Every transport sunk. Over 3,000 enemy soldiers dead. 60 more strafers were already being modified in Australia while the engineers wrote their report. General Arnold practically ran the Wright Field team out of his office. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had started just days before. Japanese codebreakers in Melbourne had decrypted enemy messages revealing a massive convoy. 8 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 troops to reinforce New Guinea. 8 destroyer escorts to protect them. The convoy route would take them across 400 miles of open water. Japanese commanders believed bad weather would shield them. March was monsoon season. Low clouds, heavy rain, poor visibility. American bombers could not hit what they could not see. They were right about the weather. They were wrong about the bombers. But that battle and the carnage that followed would have to wait. Because what happened next would shock the Japanese high command. It would reverse the momentum of the entire Pacific War. And it would prove that one mechanic with a welding torch was more valuable than 100 engineers with their calculations. In Part 2, we will see what happens when 30 impossible aircraft meet the largest Japanese convoy of the war. We will see skip bombing in action for the first time. We will see ships break apart in minutes. And we will see why the Japanese would soon call the modified B-25 the Black Death. The engineers said it could not fly. The statistics said it should not work. But Paul Gunn did not care about statistics. He cared about getting to Manila. And nothing was going to stop him. Paul Gunn had done the impossible. He had taken wrecked fighter guns and welded them into bombers. He had created aircraft that engineers declared could never fly. He had proven those engineers wrong with a perfect combat record at Buna. 16 modified A-20s had destroyed 14 Japanese aircraft without losing a single plane. But proving a concept and winning a war are two entirely different things. On February 28, 1943, Allied codebreakers in Melbourne intercepted a message that would change everything. The Japanese were sending the largest convoy of the war toward New Guinea. 8 transport ships, 8 destroyer escorts, nearly 7,000 combat troops packed into those hulls. Destination lay on New Guinea's north coast. If those troops landed, the Allied position in the Southwest Pacific would collapse. General George Kenney had exactly 72 hours to stop them. And here is where everything became worse. The conventional bomber forces had already proven useless against ships. In July 1942, B-17 flying fortresses had attacked Japanese convoys from 20,000 feet. They dropped hundreds of bombs. They hit almost nothing. The official after-action reports showed a hit rate of less than 1% against moving vessels. 1%. For every 100 bombs dropped, 99 fell into empty ocean. The brass in Washington believed in high-altitude bombing. They had invested billions of dollars in heavy bombers. They had trained thousands of bombardiers. They had built the Norden bomb site and classified it as one of America's most important secrets. The entire doctrine of American air power rested on the principle that bombers bombed from altitude. Paul Gunn's strafers violated that doctrine completely. His aircraft flew at 50 feet, not 20,000. His pilots aimed with their eyes, not bomb sights. His bombers killed with guns, not gravity. Everything about his modifications challenged what the Army Air Forces believed about warfare. Colonel Harold George commanded the 3rd Attack Group. He had seen Gunn's modifications. He had watched the Buna raid succeed. But he had also spent 20 years following regulations. His superiors in Washington had made their position clear. The Wright Field engineers had declared the modifications impractical. Continuing to fly those aircraft meant defying direct orders. George called Gunn into his office on the morning of March 1st. The convoy was already at sea. Time was running out. "Paul, I have orders from Wright Field to ground your strafers." Gunn did not flinch. "Sir, those engineers have never seen combat in the Pacific. They don't know what we're facing. They know aircraft design. They say your modifications will cause structural failures. My modifications have flown 37 combat missions without a single structural failure. How many missions have their calculations flown?" George stared at the older man. Gunn was 43 years old. He had more flight hours than most generals. His family was rotting in a Japanese prison camp while he stood here arguing about paperwork. "If I let you fly and something goes wrong, I lose my command. If you ground us and that convoy lands, you lose New Guinea." The silence stretched between them. Outside, mechanics were loading ammunition into the strafers. They did not know their aircraft might never take off. George made his decision. "General Kenney arrives this afternoon. He outranks Washington. Let him decide." But Gunn had already found an ally far more powerful than any colonel. General George Kenney had taken command of the 5th Air Force in August 1942. He was different from other generals. He had flown combat missions in World War I. He understood what pilots faced. He had personally approved Gunn's first modifications and watched the results with his own eyes. When Kenney landed at Port Moresby that afternoon, Gunn was waiting on the tarmac. The general listened for 3 minutes. Then he smiled. "Paul, how many strafers do you have ready?" 30 B-25s, 12 modified A-20s, full ammunition loads. "And the convoy?" "Entering the Vitiaz Strait tomorrow morning. We have one window to catch them in open water before they reach Leh." Kenney looked at the row of modified bombers. Their noses bristled with gun barrels. Their fuselages bore the scars of field welding. They looked nothing like the sleek aircraft rolling off American assembly lines. "The engineers in Ohio say these can't fly." "The engineers in Ohio have never been to Brisbane, sir." Kenney laughed. "Launch everything at dawn. I'll handle Washington." The order went out at 1800 hours on March 2nd. Every available aircraft would attack the convoy the following morning. B-17s from high altitude to draw defensive fire upward. Australian Beaufighters for strafing runs. P-38 Lightnings to handle Japanese fighters. And 30 B-25 strafers to deliver the killing blow. Captain Ed Larner briefed his pilots at 2200 hours. He had flown exactly one practice mission using skip bombing tactics. One mission. Now he was leading 12 strafers against the most heavily defended convoy in the Pacific. We attack at masthead height, 50 feet above the water, gun range point blank. We overwhelm their deck guns with firepower. We skip our bombs into their hulls while they're stunned. We get out before the Zeros arrive. A young lieutenant raised his hand. What if we take fire on approach? Larner paused. Then we find out what these aircraft can really do. Nobody slept that night. The pilots lay in their bunks and stared at canvas ceilings. They wrote letters home. They checked their equipment again and again. They knew the statistics. They knew how many bombers had died trying to hit ships. They knew the Japanese gunners were waiting. Dawn on March 3rd brought scattered clouds over the Bismarck Sea. The convoy was 70 miles northwest of Lai, steaming south at 12 knots. 8 transport ships spread across 5 miles of ocean. 8 destroyers forming a protective screen. Anti-aircraft guns on every deck loaded and manned. The B-17s attacked first. They came in at 15,000 feet, dropping through cloud breaks. The Japanese crews looked up. Every gun on every ship pivoted skyward. The air filled with black puffs of flak. The heavy bombers dropped 137 bombs in 20 minutes. They hit nothing. Post-battle analysis would confirm 0 direct hits on any vessel. High-altitude bombing against moving ships had failed again exactly as it had failed every time before. But the B-17s had done their job. Every Japanese gunner was looking up. The strafers came in from the southeast at wave-top height, 12 B-25s in line abreast formation. A wall of aircraft 300 yards wide flying so low their propellers nearly touched the waves. The morning sun was behind them. The Japanese lookouts were blinded. The transport Kyokusei Maru spotted them at 2 miles. The captain screamed orders to hard to starboard. The anti-aircraft crews tried to traverse their guns downward. They had trained for high-altitude attacks. They had never seen bombers flying at 50 feet. The B-25s opened fire at 800 yards. 168 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously. The sound was like nothing any sailor had ever heard. The tracers walked across the water in bright lines converging on the transport's superstructure. The bridge windows exploded inward. The captain died before he could finish his turn. The anti-aircraft crews died at their guns cut down before they could fire a single shot. 3 strafers released bombs at 100 yards. The first bomb skipped off the water like a stone. It hit the hull below the waterline. It detonated inside the engine room. The second bomb struck amidships. The third bomb missed, but 2 out of 3 was enough. Kyokusei Maru was dead in the water 30 seconds after the strafers arrived. Burning, listing, sinking. And that was just the first transport. The transport Teiyo Maru tried to run. Her captain pushed the engines to maximum speed. 15 knots. The B-25s were doing 240 knots. The mathematics were simple. 4 strafers bracketed the transport from both sides. The converging streams of 50-caliber fire shredded the deck from bow to stern. The executive officer took 3 rounds through the chest. The captain lasted 10 more seconds before a burst cut him in half. 8 bombs dropped. 5 hit. The ship broke apart. Japanese soldiers below decks never made it topside. The transport sank in 6 minutes. Survivors jumped into the sea wearing full combat gear. Their packs dragged them under. The destroyer Shikanami tried to screen the surviving transports. Australian bowfighters raked her deck first, killing the anti-aircraft crews. When the B-25 strafers arrived, the destroyer had no defense. 3 strafers attacked from different angles. Bombs hit port side, starboard side, amidships. The destroyer went dead in the water. Fires spread through her compartments. The crew abandoned ship 2 hours later. By 0900 hours, 5 transports were sinking or burning. 2 destroyers were crippled. The remaining ships scattered across 40 square miles of ocean, desperately trying to reach Lae. They did not make it. The strafers returned at 1400 hours with fresh bombs and full ammunition. The Japanese had no fighter cover. Their Zeros had landed at Leh to refuel. They were sitting on the ground when the second wave arrived. The transport Ayo Maru took 12 bomb hits in the second attack. Her ammunition magazine detonated. The explosion was visible from Port Moresby, 130 miles away. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left. No wreckage. No survivors. 1,800 Japanese soldiers gone in 3 seconds. Captain Ed Larner's strafer came in low over the transport Oigawa Maru. His co-pilot counted 14 separate fires on deck. Japanese soldiers were jumping overboard. The anti-aircraft guns were silent because the gunners were all dead. Larner released at point-blank range. 2 bombs, both hits. The transport capsized in minutes. By evening on March 3rd, the entire convoy was destroyed. 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers sunk. Of nearly 7,000 Japanese troops that left Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 reached Leh. Another 2,700 were rescued and returned to Rabaul. The rest died in the Bismarck Sea. Drowned, burned, strafed in the water. Allied losses 4 aircraft, 13 aircrew killed. General MacArthur called it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. The Japanese Navy never again attempted to reinforce New Guinea by convoy. The war in the Southwest Pacific had turned in a single day. And the man responsible was a 43-year-old mechanic who had been told his ideas were impossible. But victory in battle creates its own problems. The Wright Field engineers had not changed their minds. They were still drafting reports explaining why guns modifications could not work. The official recommendation still called for grounding every modified B-25 in the Pacific. General Kenney sent a message to General Hap Arnold in Washington on March 5th. The subject line read, "Commerce Destroyer Modifications Approved for Production." The body contained 1 paragraph. 12 B-25 strafers had just destroyed an entire Japanese convoy. Request immediate factory integration of forward gun package into all B-25 production aircraft. Arnold called North American Aviation that afternoon. The company president said his engineers needed to see the modifications. Arnold said he was sending the man who designed them. Paul Gunn was going to California. He did not want to leave Australia. His wife and children were still in Santo Tomas internment camp. Every mission took him closer to Manila. Going to California meant going in the wrong direction. But Kenney made it an order. The 5th Air Force needed factory-built strafers. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. Gunn was the only man who could show the engineers how to build them right. The general promised Gunn would be back in the Pacific within 6 weeks. Gunn landed in Long Beach on March 27, 1943. The North American Aviation Plant covered 140 acres. 20,000 workers on 3 shifts. The assembly line produced 1 B-25 every 4 hours. The factory engineers studied Gunn's hand-drawn blueprints and asked about stress calculations. Gunn said he did not have any. They asked about wind tunnel testing. Gunn said he had tested by flying. They asked about the center of gravity problem. Gunn showed them where he had moved the radio equipment aft to compensate. One engineer said the muzzle blast from the .50 caliber guns would peel the aluminum skin off the fuselage. Gunn said it did. Then he showed them the blast tubes he had welded to fix the problem. The engineers spent 2 weeks reverse engineering his field modifications into production drawings. They strengthened the nose. They redesigned the gun mounts. They added heavier aluminum patches. They calculated everything Gunn had figured out by trial and error. The first factory-built B-25G strafer rolled off the assembly line on May 10, 1943. 8 .50 caliber guns in the nose. A 75mm cannon in the forward fuselage, the same ammunition as a tank. 1 shell could hole a destroyer below the waterline. North American Aviation would build 4 900 strafer variants before the war ended. Those aircraft would sink over 800 Japanese ships. They would destroy over 2,000 aircraft on the ground. They would kill an estimated 85,000 enemy soldiers. The engineers who said it could not work watched it change the course of the war. But in Part 3, we will see that building the aircraft was only half the battle. Because when Gunn returned to the Pacific, he discovered that the Japanese had learned from the Bismarck Sea. They had changed their tactics. They had improved their defenses. And they were hunting the strafers with a new weapon that Gunn had never anticipated. The Japanese called his modified B-25s the Black Death. Now they were determined to kill the man who created it. And Paul Gunn's family was still waiting in Manila. Paul Gunn had proven the impossible. He had built aircraft that engineers said could not fly. He had destroyed an entire Japanese convoy in a single day. He had convinced the largest aircraft manufacturer in America to mass-produce his designs. By May 1943, factory-built strafers were rolling off assembly lines in California. But the Japanese were not defeated. They were adapting. Intelligence reports from captured documents revealed the truth. Japanese Naval Command had conducted a complete analysis of the Bismarck Sea disaster. They knew exactly what had happened. They knew American bombers had attacked at masthead height. They knew skip bombing had destroyed their transports. They knew the modified B-25s carried forward-firing guns that killed their anti-aircraft crews before they could respond. And they were determined to find a countermeasure. The statistics told a brutal story. In March 1943, Japanese shipping losses in the Southwest Pacific increased 340% compared to the previous 3 months. 47 vessels sunk or damaged beyond repair. Over 12,000 soldiers killed at sea before reaching their destinations. Supply lines that had operated freely for 18 months were now death traps. Japanese Admiral Junichi Kusaka issued new orders to every convoy commander. Ships would travel only at night. They would hug coastlines where strafers could not approach from multiple angles. They would carry additional anti-aircraft guns specifically designed to engage low-flying aircraft. And most importantly, they would never sail without fighter cover. The era of easy kills was over. The real war was just beginning. But the Japanese response was not the only challenge Gunn faced when he returned to Australia in May 1943. The factory-built B-25G strafers had arrived. Beautiful aircraft with professional engineering, reinforced noses, proper gun mounts, factory-calculated center of gravity, and a 75mm cannon in the forward fuselage that fired tank ammunition. The cannon was a disaster. The M4 75mm gun had been designed for ground combat. It weighed over 900 pounds. When fired, it recoiled 4 feet backward. The entire aircraft shuddered like it had been struck by lightning. The navigator had to manually reload each round. 1 shell every 30 seconds. The first combat mission with the 75mm cannon nearly ended in catastrophe. Lieutenant James Parker fired at a Japanese cargo ship from 400 yards. The recoil threw his B-25 off course. His second shot missed by 50 feet because the aircraft was still recovering. The Japanese gunners had time to traverse their weapons and return fire. Parker took 17 hits before escaping. Pilots hated the 75mm cannon. They called it the flying coffin. 3 aircraft were lost in the first month because crews could not stabilize after firing. The weapon that was supposed to sink destroyers was getting American pilots killed instead. Some commanders blamed Gunn. He had started this. He had convinced everyone that bombers should carry forward guns. Now those guns were causing problems he had never anticipated. A colonel at 5th Air Force Headquarters suggested that perhaps the right field engineers had been right all along. For 2 weeks, Gunn worked without sleep. He studied the 75mm recoil patterns. He talked to every pilot who had fired the weapon in combat. He analyzed the failures and searched for solutions. The answer was not removing the cannon. The answer was changing how pilots used it. Gunn developed new attack protocols. Fire the cannon first at maximum range 800 yards to suppress deck gunners. Then close to 200 yards and finish with the 50 caliber guns. Never fire the cannon below 300 feet, because the recoil would drive the aircraft into the water. Never fire more than 2 rounds per pass, because the reload time left the aircraft vulnerable. The revised tactics worked. By July 1943, B-25G losses dropped 60%. The 75mm cannon became a destroyer killer. 1 shell through the hull below the waterline, and even warships went down. But Gunn was not satisfied with fixing problems. He wanted to create something even more devastating. November 2, 1943. Rabaul Harbor, the most heavily defended Japanese base in the South Pacific. Rabaul sat on the northeastern tip of New Britain, 600 miles from Port Moresby. The harbor was a natural fortress. Mountains surrounded it on 3 sides. The entrance was narrow, easily defended. The Japanese had packed the harbor with warships transport supply vessels. Over 100,000 troops were based in the area. 400 anti-aircraft guns protected the anchorage. Every Allied commander considered Rabaul untouchable. The defenses were too strong. The fighter presence too heavy. Any attack would suffer catastrophic losses. General Kenny decided to attack anyway. He assembled the largest strafer force of the war. 59 B-25s, 23 P-38 Lightnings for escort, dozens of Australian Beaufighters. Total aircraft 137. Major Ben Fridge led the B-25 formation. His orders were simple: destroy everything in the harbor. Accept no losses that could be avoided. Get in fast. Get out faster. The strafers approached from the southwest at 0715 hours. Low cloud cover concealed their approach. The Japanese radar operators saw nothing until the aircraft were 15 miles out. By then it was too late. The P-38s hit the airfields first. Japanese Zeros were scrambling when American fighters caught them on the runways. 12 Zeros destroyed before they could take off. The fighter cover that was supposed to protect Rabaul was burning on the ground. The B-25s came in at 50 feet. Line abreast formation. 59 aircraft spreading across a mile of ocean. The harbor opened before them like a target range. The destroyer Mochizuki was anchored near the harbor entrance. Her crew saw the strafers at 2 miles. The captain ordered battle stations. Men ran to their guns. They had trained for this. They knew the American tactics. They were not fast enough. The first wave of strafers opened fire at 800 yards. 450 caliber guns firing simultaneously. The tracers converged on Mochizuki's superstructure. The bridge dissolved in a storm of metal. The captain died with his hands on the railing. The anti-aircraft crews died at their weapons. The destroyer's guns fell silent before firing a single round. 6 B-25s dropped bombs. 4 hits. Mochizuki rolled to starboard and began sinking by the bow. The second wave hit the cargo ships at anchor. They could not run. They could not maneuver. They were sitting targets. The strafers came in from multiple directions. The Japanese gunners tried to track them. Too many targets. Too many angles. Too fast. The cargo ship Hako Maru took 20 bomb hits in 90 seconds. Her hull opened in a dozen places. Fire reached the ammunition storage. The explosion killed every man aboard and damaged 2 ships anchored nearby. The tanker Naruo Maru was loaded with aviation fuel for the Rabaul airfields. 3 strafers bracketed her from both sides. Their 50s ignited the cargo. The tanker became a fireball visible for 30 miles. The crew never had time to abandon ship. Smoke rose over the harbor like a black curtain. Ships burned everywhere. Explosions echoed across the water. The anti-aircraft fire that had terrified Allied planners was sporadic, uncoordinated, ineffective. The gunners could not track targets flying 50 feet above the waves. Major Fridge made a second pass over the harbor. He counted fires. He counted sinking vessels. He counted floating debris that had been ships 5 minutes earlier. His bombardier was shouting numbers into the intercom. 20 hits. 30 hits. The count kept climbing. The strafers were in and out of Rabaul in 15 minutes. 15 minutes to devastate the most powerful Japanese base in the South Pacific. The final tally: 38 vessels hit, 5 sunk outright, 12 damaged beyond repair. The rest would need months to become operational. Japanese dead: over 2,000 sailors and soldiers. Aircraft destroyed: 37, including the 12 Zeros caught on the ground. American losses: none. 0 aircraft lost in the attack on the most heavily defended harbor in the Pacific. General Kenny received the after-action report that evening. He read the numbers twice. Then he sent a message to General MacArthur in Brisbane. Rabaul Harbor finished as forward supply base. Recommend immediate offensive operations toward Philippines. The impact spread like fire through dry grass. News of Rabaul reached every Allied unit in the Pacific within 48 hours. Pilots who had feared the Japanese defenses now believed they could strike anywhere. Ground commanders who had dreaded enemy reinforcements now knew those supplies would never arrive. The momentum of the war shifted in a single morning. The Japanese response revealed their desperation. Admiral Kusaka withdrew his remaining combat vessels from Rabaul to Truk, 700 miles to the north. The garrison that had threatened all of New Guinea became isolated, cut off, irrelevant. 100,000 Japanese soldiers would spend the rest of the war watching their supplies dwindle and their empire collapse. The statistics from the following 6 months told the story of transformation. Strafer missions increased 400%. Japanese shipping losses exceeded 200 vessels per month. By early 1944, the Japanese merchant marine had lost the capacity to supply forward bases. The island-hopping campaign that would carry MacArthur to the Philippines became possible because the enemy could not reinforce their positions. Paul Gunn flew the Rabaul mission. He was 44 years old. He did not have to fly combat. He was a staff officer, a technical advisor, a headquarters fixture. But his family was still in Manila. Every mission carried him closer. The Distinguished Flying Cross citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism. The Silver Star recognized his leadership. The Air Medal with 9 oak leaf clusters acknowledged his cumulative service. Commanders recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. The recommendation was denied. Some officers believed Gunn's contributions were technical rather than tactical. They were wrong, but the paperwork disappeared into Army bureaucracy. Gunn did not care about medals. He cared about 2 things: building better strafers and liberating his family. The B-25H arrived in October 1943. Improved recoil system for the 75mm cannon. Additional 50 caliber guns in cheek packs. 14 forward-firing guns total. The H model could destroy a destroyer with guns alone without dropping a single bomb. The B-25J followed in early 1944. No cannon but 18 50 caliber machine guns. The most heavily armed production bomber in history. When a J model opened fire, it put more lead into a target than an entire squadron of fighters. By mid-1944, strafers were operating from Australia to Burma. They hunted Japanese shipping in the Philippines. They attacked supply lines in China. They struck targets in the Netherlands, East Indies. The concept Paul Gunn had proven in Brisbane had spread across the entire Pacific War. The Japanese called the modified B-25s the Black Death. Their sailors feared the low-flying bombers more than any other American weapon. Convoy duty became a death sentence. Experienced crews refused assignments to transport ships. Morale in the Japanese merchant marine collapsed completely. But numbers and victories do not tell the whole story. In Part 4, we will learn what happened to Paul Gunn after the strafers changed the war. We will discover the fate of his family in Santo Tomas. We will see his final mission and his unexpected end, and we will understand why the most important aircraft designer of the Pacific War was almost completely forgotten by history. The engineers called his modifications impossible. The commanders called his tactics insane. The Japanese called his aircraft death itself. But Paul Gunn called it something else. He called it the road to Manila. And that road was about to reach its destination. A 43-year-old mechanic crouched under a bomber wing in Brisbane, with an idea that every engineer called impossible. He welded fighter guns into aircraft that were never designed to carry them. He created flying destroyers that violated every principle of aeronautical engineering. He proved the experts wrong in the Bismarck Sea at Rabaul, across the entire Southwest Pacific. Paul Gunn's modified B-25s sank over 800 Japanese ships. They destroyed more than 2,000 aircraft on the ground. They killed an estimated 85,000 enemy soldiers. They changed the course of the Pacific War and shortened it by months, perhaps years. But what happened to the man who made it all possible? This story has one final twist, a chapter that most history books forgot to write. Because success in war sometimes comes with a price that numbers cannot measure. And for Paul Gunn, that price was waiting in Manila. On February 3, 1945, American forces reached Santo Tomas internment camp. The gates opened after 3 years and 26 days. 700 Allied prisoners walked out into sunlight they had not seen as free people since January 1942. Paul Gunn's wife Polly was among them. She weighed 89 pounds. Before the war, she had weighed 135. Her daughter Julia weighed 63 pounds. Their son Nathaniel had contracted malaria that the camp doctors could not treat. Their youngest daughter suffered from dysentery that had nearly killed her twice. The Gunn family had survived on rice and vegetable soup, one small portion per day, for the past year. The Japanese camp commander had informed the Red Cross that all prisoners would be executed if Allied forces approached Manila. The approaching forces had reached them just in time. Paul Gunn flew to Manila on February 4, 1945. He was not supposed to fly. His leg was still bandaged from shrapnel wounds he had received at Tacloban airfield 3 months earlier. A Japanese bombing raid had caught him in the operations tent. Metal fragments had severed an artery. The surgeons had told him he would never fly combat again. He had ignored them. He had been ignoring orders and regulations for 3 years. He was not going to stop now, not when his family was finally free. Polly did not recognize him at first. He had lost 40 pounds since she had last seen him in April 1942. His hair had turned completely gray. The stress of combat, the weight of knowing his family was suffering while he could do nothing, had aged him 20 years in 3. She thought he was a doctor. Then he said her name. She knew. The official Army report stated that Colonel Paul Gunn was reunited with his family on February 4, 1945 at Santo Tomas internment camp Manila. The reunion lasted 4 hours. Then Gunn returned to Leyte. His medical leave was not over, but the war was not over either. There were still Japanese ships to sink. There were still missions to fly. The leg wound ended his operational career. The shrapnel had caused damage that would not heal properly. The Army retired him as a full colonel on June 30, 1946. Medical disability. He was 46 years old. But the legacy of Paul Gunn did not end when he stopped flying. It was only beginning. The modifications he designed in Brisbane became the foundation for attack aviation that continues to this day. The concept of forward-firing guns on ground attack aircraft, the idea that was declared impossible in 1942, became standard doctrine within 5 years. North American aviation built 9 600 B-25 Mitchell bombers during World War II. Nearly 5,000 were strafer variants with forward gun packages based on Gunn's original design. Those aircraft served not only in the Pacific, but in Europe, North Africa, and the China-Burma-India theater. Every major Allied air force flew modified Mitchells against enemy shipping and ground targets. After the war, the principles Gunn established evolved into new generations of attack aircraft. The Douglas A-26 Innovator carried forward-firing guns into Korea. The A-1 Sky Raider flew ground support missions in Vietnam using tactics Gunn would have recognized. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the legendary Warthog that destroyed Iraqi armor in Desert Storm, carries the same fundamental design philosophy: overwhelming forward firepower delivered at low altitude. The AC-130 gunship, circling above battlefields from Vietnam to Afghanistan, traces its lineage directly to Gunn's converted B-25s. The concept of a flying gun platform, an aircraft designed to strafe rather than bomb, began in a Brisbane hangar in 1942. Military historians estimate that Gunn's innovations influenced attack aviation for 8 decades. The tactics he developed, the approach profiles he tested, the survival techniques he pioneered, became training doctrine at Air Force academies around the world. Pilots who have never heard his name fly missions using principles he established. The numbers are staggering when calculated across 80 years. Hundreds of thousands of combat missions flown with forward-firing guns. Tens of thousands of enemy vehicles, ships, and installations destroyed. An incalculable number of friendly lives saved because attack aircraft could suppress enemy defenses before ground troops advanced. All of it traces back to a mechanic who refused to accept that his idea was impossible. But the greatest lesson from Paul Gunn's story is not about aircraft or weapons. It is about the nature of innovation itself. The Army Air Forces had thousands of trained engineers in 1942. They had wind tunnels, stress calculators, aerodynamics laboratories. They had the most advanced aircraft design facilities in the world. Yet none of them conceived what Gunn conceived. None of them saw what he saw. The experts looked at bombers and saw bombing platforms. Gunn looked at bombers and saw potential. The experts thought within categories. Gunn thought without them. The experts calculated what was possible according to existing knowledge. Gunn discovered what was possible through experimentation. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The best ideas often come from people who are close to the problem, but outside the system that created the problem. The tank was developed despite opposition from cavalry officers who dominated military thinking. Radar succeeded because scientists ignored admirals who believed ships would always fight at visual range. The Jeep became ubiquitous because frontline soldiers proved its value, while procurement officers questioned its specifications. Innovation requires more than intelligence. It requires courage. The courage to propose something that experts ridicule. The courage to test something that might fail publicly. The courage to persist when authorities demand conformity. Paul Gunn had that courage. He also had motivation that no engineer in Ohio could match. His family was in a Japanese prison camp. Every day he did not fight was a day they suffered. Every improvement he made brought liberation closer. The experts had nothing at stake except their reputations. Gunn had everything at stake. And there is one detail about Paul Gunn that almost no one knows, a piece of the story that remained hidden for decades. When Gunn returned to the Philippines after the war, he did not rest. He did not retire to enjoy the family he had fought so hard to free. Instead, he rebuilt Philippine Airlines, the company he had started before the Japanese invasion destroyed it. He acquired 3 surplus C-47 transport aircraft from military auctions. He flew routes between Manila and the outlying islands, carrying passengers and cargo to communities that had been isolated during the occupation. By 1956, Philippine Airlines was flying to San Francisco. The small inter-island airline had become an international carrier. Gunn could not stop moving. His pilots said he was still fighting something. Maybe the memories of Santo Tomas. Maybe the faces of crews who had flown his aircraft and never returned. Maybe the restlessness of a man who had spent 3 years racing toward a goal and did not know how to stop racing. On October 11, 1957, Gunn was flying a Beechcraft Model 18 from Manila to Baguio. Routine flight, 140 miles. The weather deteriorated faster than forecast. Heavy rain obscured the Cordillera Mountains. His radio went silent at 10:47 in the morning. Search teams found the wreckage 3 days later on a mountainside. The aircraft had flown into a storm cell. The pilot had tried to climb above it. The winds drove them into the ridge. Impact killed everyone instantly. Paul Irvin Gunn died 11 days before his 58th birthday. The man who had survived hundreds of combat missions, who had been wounded by Japanese bombs, who had flown aircraft that engineers said would crash, died on a routine passenger flight in peacetime. The Philippine government gave him a state funeral. 6,000 people attended. American veterans, Philippine Airlines employees, former prisoners from Santo Tomas, families of the soldiers his strafers had protected. General George Kenney sent a wreath from the United States. The Manila Times ran his obituary the next day. War hero dies in plane crash. The article mentioned his distinguished flying cross, his role in the Bismarck Sea, his liberation missions over the Philippines. But it could not capture what he had actually done. The full truth lay in numbers that took decades to compile. 5,000 B-25 strafers built with his modifications. 800 Japanese ships sunk. 2,000 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 85,000 enemy soldiers killed. An untold number of Allied lives saved because his aircraft suppressed defenses, before invasions destroyed supplies, before battles sank transports, before reinforcements arrived. And one family of 5, weighing less together than a single healthy man, walking out of Santo Tomas alive because their father refused to accept the impossible. From a Navy mechanic with a welding torch and a desperate idea to the transformation of attack aviation for 80 years. Paul Gunn proved that innovation does not require permission. It requires persistence. It requires the willingness to be called crazy until the results speak for themselves. The engineers at Wright Field wrote their report explaining why his modifications could not work. That report sat in Army archives, while 5,000 aircraft built on his designs flew combat missions across the Pacific. The experts were never formally corrected. They simply became irrelevant. History remembers generals and admirals. It remembers presidents who made strategic decisions and pilots who became aces. It rarely remembers the mechanics, the technicians, the problem solvers who worked in hangars while others made speeches. Paul Gunn never sought fame. He sought results. He sought his family. He sought victory. He found all three. If you know stories like this, forgotten innovators whose ideas changed history, share them in the comments below. World War II produced hundreds of people like Paul Gunn, men and women whose contributions shaped the modern world, but whose names have faded from memory. Subscribe to discover more of these untold stories. There are pilots, engineers, medics, and ordinary soldiers whose ingenuity saved thousands of lives and whose stories deserve to be heard. Because the next time someone tells you that your idea is impossible, remember this. A 43-year-old mechanic with no engineering degree, no wind tunnel, no computer simulations built aircraft that the experts said could not fly. Those aircraft sank an empire. The engineers called his B-25 gunship impossible. History called it the weapon that won the Pacific. And Paul Gunn called it one thing only: the road home.